all set in motion by a desperate widow's impulsive purchase of an abandoned gold mine she could barely afford. A deteriorating 1870s mining operation in a forgotten Colorado mountain town that would eventually bring archaeologists from the Smithsonian Institution to her doorstep, trigger urgent preservation orders from the Historical Mining Commission, and ultimately reveal a concealed chamber containing Confederate Treasury gold that had remained untouched for over 155 years. A discovery that would rewrite Civil War scholarship and transform one woman's story of financial collapse into an extraordinary legacy of historical preservation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Olivia Blackwell, a 47-year-old former historical artifacts appraiser whose world shattered when her husband's 4-year battle with pancreatic cancer consumed not just their savings, but their entire future. The woman who once authenticated historical artifacts for prestigious auction houses and private collectors was about to make a $250 purchase that seemed like the final mistake in a series of devastating financial decisions. Olivia stared at the foreclosure notice taped to her front door, the crisp November morning air cutting through her wool cardigan as she fumbled with keys to her modest craftsman home in Durango, Colorado. The stark white paper with its official seals and legal terminology represented the final countdown of a financial disaster that had been building for 4 years. Ever since Michael's diagnosis with stage 4 pancreatic cancer had transformed their comfortable middle-class life into a desperate struggle for survival, the numbers were merciless in their precision. Total outstanding debt, $78,600. Current bank balance, $312.47. Days until forced eviction, 14. Each figure represented a piece of the life she and Michael had built together over 22 years of marriage, now reduced to mathematical calculations that showed no mercy for love, loss, or the devastating medical expenses that had consumed everything they'd worked to achieve. Inside the house, Olivia spread the collection of past due notices across their kitchen table, the same walnut table where she and Michael had once planned hiking trips through European mountains and discussed their dream of opening a small appraisal shop specializing in American frontier artifacts. The harsh morning light illuminated a financial catastrophe that seemed impossible to escape. Mortgage payments 4 months behind, totaling $9,200. Medical bills from Michael's treatments exceeding $42,000 despite insurance coverage. And credit card debt accumulated during his illness reaching $27,400. The irony wasn't lost on Olivia that a woman who had spent her career evaluating the monetary and historical worth of artifacts was now completely unable to assign value to her own possessions in any way that could save her home. Her expertise in 19th century American frontier artifacts, once valued by major auction houses and private collectors, had become professionally irrelevant in a market that had shifted toward digital authentication methods and contemporary collectibles that made her traditional skills seem antiquated. Michael Blackwell had been a geological engineer specializing in environmental impact assessment, work that had brought them to western Colorado 14 years earlier when a major mining corporation had contracted his firm to evaluate sustainable practices for operations in the mineral-rich mountains. His methodical approach to scientific problems and Olivia's historical sensibility had created a partnership that balanced analytical precision with historical context, evident in every aspect of their shared life from the restored 1920s craftsman home to the carefully curated collection of mining tools and frontier artifacts that filled their living space. The diagnosis had arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October, delivered by Dr. Samuel Winters at Mercy Regional Medical Center with a clinical directness that medical professionals use to communicate devastating news. The scans confirmed stage 4 pancreatic cancer, he had explained to Olivia and Michael. their hands clasped together in the sterile examination room. "We'll develop a comprehensive care plan to manage symptoms and explore treatment options, but you should understand that this is a challenging diagnosis." What Dr. Winters couldn't convey in that moment was how completely cancer would dismantle not just Michael's physical capabilities, but the entire infrastructure of their financial security. The aggressive disease had required increasingly expensive treatments, specialized therapies, and home modifications that transformed their modest savings into inadequate resources, consumed by immediate survival needs rather than long-term planning. Michael's decline had been both rapid and expensive. The strong hands that had once operated complex geological monitoring equipment gradually lost their dexterity, requiring assistance technologies that insurance companies classified as quality of life improvements rather than medical necessities. His clear voice, which had confidently presented environmental findings to corporate boards and government agencies, had been reduced to painful whispers through the progression of his illness. Most devastating had been watching Michael's brilliant, analytical mind remain completely intact while his body systematically failed, creating a cruel awareness of everything being lost while maintaining the intellectual capacity to understand each progressive limitation. He had continued working from home for 14 months after diagnosis, adapting his consulting practice to accommodate physical restrictions while Olivia juggled her appraisal work with increasing caregiving responsibilities. The financial devastation had accelerated during Michael's final year, when round-the-clock care requirements had forced Olivia to resign from her position with Frontier Antiquities, a prestigious auction house specializing in Western Americana. Her salary of $61,000 annually had provided the stable foundation for their household budget, while Michael's consulting income had funded their savings and discretionary spending. Losing her income while medical expenses tripled had created an impossible mathematical equation that no amount of careful budgeting could solve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The life insurance policy that should have provided financial stability had become another casualty of Michael's illness. The $250,000 policy they had maintained for 15 years included a clause excluding coverage for pre-existing conditions that weren't disclosed at the time of application. Michael's initial symptoms, which had been attributed to stress and digestive issues rather than cancer, had been documented in medical records 20 months before his formal diagnosis, creating grounds for the insurance company to deny the claim. That would have prevented Olivia's current financial catastrophe. The rejection letter from Mountain States Insurance remained in Olivia's desk drawer, its legal language explaining how failure to disclose relevant medical history had voided their policy despite 15 years of faithful premium payments. The company's investigation had discovered Michael's visits to his primary care physician for back pain and unexplained weight loss, symptoms that seemed manageable at the time, but were later identified as early indicators of pancreatic cancer, providing legal justification for denying benefits when they were most desperately needed. Olivia's attempts to maintain employment while caring for Michael had been complicated by the specialized nature of her expertise. Her knowledge of American frontier artifacts from 1800 to 1900 was highly specific but not easily transferable to other employment opportunities in western Colorado, where the job market favored tourism, hospitality, healthcare, and modern technology rather than historical authentication requiring her particular academic background. The part-time position she had managed to secure after leaving Frontier Antiquities provided minimal income that couldn't address the mounting debt accumulated during Michael's illness. Working 18 hours weekly at a local history museum for $14 per hour generated only $1,008 monthly before taxes, while evening shifts cataloging artifacts for a university collection added another $800 to her income, creating a total monthly earnings of approximately $1,800 that was insufficient to cover essential expenses, let alone address accumulated debt. The house that Olivia and Michael had purchased in 2011 for $210,000 had seemed like a sound investment in Durango's growing community. The 1924 Craftsman home on a quarter-acre had provided space for Michael's home office and Olivia's authentication workspace, while appreciating property values had created equity that they had planned to access for retirement funding. The three-bedroom house with original woodwork and mountain views had represented stability and community connection in a region they had chosen for its natural beauty and historical significance. But the mortgage that had been easily manageable with their combined income had become impossible to maintain on Olivia's part-time earnings. The monthly payment of $1,640 consumed most of her income, creating an unsustainable situation that had led to the foreclosure proceedings now threatening to eliminate her last connection to the life she and Michael had built together. Selling the house would have been the logical solution, except that current property values in their neighborhood had declined due to economic uncertainty, meaning sale proceeds wouldn't cover the outstanding mortgage balance, plus accumulated penalties and legal fees. Olivia's daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival, managing grief while simultaneously addressing practical challenges that required constant attention. Her mornings began at 5 a.m. with job searches and application submissions, targeting any position that might utilize her organizational skills and attention to detail. The remainder of her day was divided between her part-time work commitments and evening hours spent researching financial assistance programs, debt consolidation options, and legal aid resources that might provide alternatives to foreclosure. The emotional toll of simultaneous grief and financial crisis had created what Dr. Emily Carson, Olivia's counselor at the Mountain Wellness Center, identified as compound trauma that made recovery from either challenge significantly more difficult. You're processing the loss of your spouse while simultaneously facing the loss of your home, financial security, and professional identity. Dr. Carson had explained during their weekly sessions funded through sliding scale fees that Olivia could barely afford. Each loss reinforces the others, creating a cycle that can feel overwhelming. The isolation that accompanied Olivia's circumstances had been unexpected and difficult to manage. Friends from the antiquities community offered emotional support, but had their own professional and family obligations that limited practical assistance. Colleagues from Michael's environmental consulting network provided sympathy but were located primarily in other states, making their support meaningful but not immediately helpful for addressing housing and financial challenges. The neighborhood, where Olivia and Michael had lived for 14 years, had been populated by other professional couples with similar interests in outdoor recreation, environmental issues, and cultural heritage. But the social connections that had flourished when Olivia and Michael were active participants in local events had gradually diminished as her circumstances changed, creating awkward interactions with neighbors who didn't know how to respond to her dramatic lifestyle changes. Olivia's brother, Thomas, who lived in Portland with his family, had offered to help with temporary housing, but relocating would require abandoning the job opportunities she had developed in Durango while starting over in a city where she had no professional connections or familiarity with local cultural institutions. The decision represented choosing between maintaining some elements of the life she had built with Michael versus accepting help that would require abandoning everything familiar during an already traumatic period. Most painful was Olivia's recognition that Michael's death had eliminated not just her life partner, but also her primary emotional support during the worst financial crisis she had ever experienced. The person who would have helped her analyze options and develop strategies for addressing their debt was the same person whose illness had created the financial emergency, leaving Olivia to navigate complex decisions while processing grief that made concentration and rational planning significantly more difficult. The medical bills that continued arriving months after Michael's death served as recurring reminders of both her loss, and her impossible financial situation. Statements from specialists, equipment rental companies, and pharmaceutical providers created a paper trail of the final year's desperate attempts to maintain Michael's comfort and dignity, now transformed into financial obligations that threatened to eliminate any possibility of stability in Olivia's future. The $250 that remained in Olivia's checking account after paying essential utilities and groceries represented the complete extent of her liquid assets, money that needed to last until her next paychecks, while also covering gasoline for job interviews and basic household necessities. The amount was simultaneously everything she had, and completely inadequate for addressing any unexpected expense or opportunity that might require immediate financial commitment. Olivia's morning routine of reviewing job listings and financial obligations had become a ritual of managed desperation, each day requiring careful calculation of which bills could be delayed, which opportunities might be worth pursuing, and which aspects of her former life needed to be abandoned to focus on immediate survival. The woman who had once confidently evaluated six-figure artifact collections was now overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations that all seemed equally urgent and impossible to address. The local history museum, where Olivia worked part-time, had become a daily reminder of the irony in her situation. Surrounded by historical objects that she could accurately date, authenticate, and price for collectors, she was completely unable to identify anything in her own life that could be sold for sufficient funds to address her housing crisis. Her expertise remained intact, but its commercial value had evaporated in circumstances that required immediate cash rather than specialized knowledge. But it was during one of these desperate morning job searches that Olivia's phone displayed a notification that would change the trajectory of her story. A property alert she had set up months earlier, when still hoping to find affordable rental housing, had identified a foreclosure auction in Silver Cliff, a small mining community 80 miles northeast of Durango. The listing showed a deteriorating 1870s mining operation being sold by the county for unpaid taxes. With a minimum bid of just $250, the property, according to the sparse description, had been abandoned for decades and required extensive work before being suitable for any practical use. Something about the listing caught Olivia's attention in ways that she couldn't immediately explain, perhaps representing an alternative to the gradual loss of everything that had defined her life with Michael. As she stared at the auction notice, Olivia realized she was looking at an opportunity that was either completely irrational or potentially transformative, and she no longer had enough left to lose to let fear make the decision for her. The real estate notification about the Silver Cliff mine had appeared at the worst possible moment, when Olivia's morning routine of reviewing foreclosure documents and overdue bills had reached its most desperate point. She stared at the listing on her phone screen, its $250 minimum bid representing exactly the amount remaining in her checking account after paying the water bill that would keep her plumbing functioning for another month. The coincidence felt like either cosmic irony or divine intervention, though Olivia wasn't sure she believed in either anymore. Silver Cliff, Colorado was a town she remembered visiting once with Michael during their early years in the region, when they had spent weekends exploring small mountain communities and documenting the architectural remnants of the area's mining heritage. Michael had been fascinated by the engineering challenges of extracting minerals from challenging mountain terrain, while Olivia had photographed the artifacts and structures that reflected frontier-era optimism about resource extraction, connecting isolated communities to broader economic opportunities. The memory of that long-ago afternoon felt both precious and painful as Olivia enlarged the auction listing photos on her laptop screen. The Silver Cliff mine, established in 1873 according to the county records, showed the distinctive architectural features of frontier mining operations from the post-Civil War expansion period. Despite obvious deterioration from decades of abandonment, Olivia could identify the quality craftsmanship in the surviving structures, the elegant functionality of the main building, and the detailed stonework around entrance points that had somehow endured decades of neglect. But recognizing the property's historical significance only emphasized the impossibility of Olivia's current circumstances. Her expertise in American frontier artifacts had trained her to appreciate the historical and practical value of 19th century craftsmanship. Yet this knowledge felt mockingly irrelevant when she couldn't afford to maintain her own modest home, let alone take responsibility for preserving a deteriorating mining operation that would require tens of thousands of dollars in restoration work. The practical challenges were immediately obvious, even from the limited auction information. The mine had been abandoned since 1935, when the last commercial operations had been discontinued due to declining ore quality and increasing extraction costs. 80 years of abandonment had created structural issues that would require professional assessment before the property could be safely accessed or used for any commercial purpose. The county's decision to auction the property resulted from accumulated property taxes and safety violations that local government was unwilling to address through public funds. More concerning was Olivia's complete lack of experience with historic preservation projects. Her appraisal work had involved evaluating and documenting artifacts within controlled environments, not managing the complex logistics of structural restoration that required coordination with contractors, compliance with historical preservation regulations, and navigation of mining safety requirements. The skills that had made her valuable as an appraiser had no apparent application to the overwhelming practical challenges of rehabilitating an abandoned mining operation. Yet something about the listing continued to capture Olivia's attention in ways that transcended logical assessment of the challenges involved. Perhaps it was the connection to memories of exploring similar sites with Michael, when their future had seemed filled with possibilities for collaborative projects that combined his geological expertise with her historical knowledge. Or perhaps it was the desperate recognition that conventional approaches to her financial crisis had proved completely inadequate, making an unconventional decision seem worth considering despite obvious risks. The auction was scheduled for the following Wednesday, exactly 9 days before the foreclosure deadline that would force Olivia from her home. The timing created an impossible choice between using her last financial resources for a speculative property purchase or maintaining those funds for essential expenses during what might be her final weeks in Durango. The rational decision was obviously to preserve her remaining money for moving expenses and security deposits that would be required for whatever modest rental housing she might be able to secure. But rationality hadn't prevented the financial catastrophe that had consumed Olivia's savings, eliminated her career prospects, and left her facing homelessness despite years of responsible financial planning and professional achievement. Careful, logical approaches that had defined her previous decision-making had proved completely inadequate for addressing the extraordinary circumstances created by Michael's illness and death. Perhaps those same careful approaches were equally inadequate for recognizing opportunities that might exist outside conventional expectations. Olivia spent the remainder of that morning researching Silver Cliff's economic and demographic profile, discovering a small mountain community that had experienced modest population growth as outdoor recreation opportunities allowed urban professionals to relocate to areas with lower housing costs and scenic environments. The town's main street featured a mix of local businesses and services that suggested economic stability without significant prosperity, while recent residential development indicated demand for housing among newcomers attracted to the region's natural amenities. The information painted a picture of a community in transition, adapting to economic changes while maintaining connections to its historical identity as a mining town that had once connected mountain mineral resources with industrial markets. The mine's location just outside Silver Cliff's modest downtown suggested potential visibility and accessibility, That might support tourism uses if the property could be restored to safe condition. More intriguingly, Olivia's research revealed that Silvercliff was located within the designated boundaries of the Rocky Mountain Heritage Trail, a state tourism initiative that promoted historical sites related to the region's mining and frontier development. The program provided grants and technical assistance for preservation projects that created educational opportunities and economic development in rural communities, suggesting potential funding sources that might help address restoration costs. If a viable preservation plan could be developed, the possibilities were tantalizing, but required expertise and resources that Olivia didn't possess. Historic preservation projects involved complex regulations, specialized contractors, and significant financial commitments that were completely beyond her current capabilities. The gap between recognizing potential value and having the means to realize that potential felt insurmountable, yet another reminder of how completely her circumstances had changed since Michael's death. But as Olivia continued researching the mine and Silvercliff's historical context, she began to recognize connections between the property's significance and her own professional background that might provide advantages she hadn't initially considered. Her appraisal experience had included evaluating mining artifacts and frontier tools that required historical research, condition assessments, and coordination with specialists in authentication and preservation techniques. While she had never managed building restoration, the underlying skills of historical documentation, artifact evaluation, and resource coordination were directly relevant to preservation work. More significantly, Olivia's academic background included a master's degree in American Studies with a concentration in frontier material culture from the University of Colorado, exactly the period when the Silvercliff mine had been constructed. Her graduate research had examined the relationship between resource extraction and regional economic development in the post-Civil War West, focusing on how mining operations had influenced settlement patterns and community planning in small towns throughout the Rocky Mountain regions. The specialized knowledge that had seemed professionally irrelevant in her current job search might actually provide crucial insights for understanding the mine's historical significance and developing appropriate preservation strategies. Her familiarity with frontier-era construction techniques, understanding of mining history, and experience with artifact documentation could potentially compensate for her lack of direct preservation experience, especially if she could identify consultants and contractors with relevant expertise. But recognizing these potential advantages only emphasized the fundamental obstacle of financing any preservation effort when Olivia could barely afford basic living expenses. The $250 auction price was merely the beginning of costs that would quickly escalate once restoration work began. Safety assessments, structural repairs, environmental remediation, and countless other requirements would create expenses that could easily reach $100,000 or more before the property could be used for any productive purpose. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was undeniable, yet Olivia found herself unable to dismiss the opportunity entirely. Something about the mine listing had triggered a sense of connection and possibility that felt more authentic than any of the conventional employment opportunities she had been pursuing. Her job search efforts had consistently resulted in rejection letters that emphasized her overqualification for available positions or her lack of relevant experience for roles that might utilize her specialized knowledge. The afternoon brought another round of disappointing responses to recent job applications. A visitor services position at a local tourist attraction had been filled by a candidate with more extensive hospitality experience. An administrative role at a regional medical center required certification in medical terminology that Olivia didn't possess. Even a part-time position cataloging historical photographs at a nearby library had been awarded to a recent information science graduate who could commit to full-time availability when needed. Each rejection reinforced Olivia's growing recognition that her professional skills and experience didn't align with available employment opportunities in Western Colorado's job market. The specialized expertise that had once provided career security and financial stability was increasingly irrelevant in an economy that valued different qualifications and experience bases. At 47, Olivia was competing against younger candidates who could accept lower salaries and older workers who had decades of experience in locally relevant industries. The age discrimination that affected Olivia's job prospects was subtle but persistent, evident in interview feedback that emphasized cultural fit and energy rather than qualifications and experience. Hiring managers seemed uncomfortable with her appraisal background, viewing her specialized knowledge as impractical rather than valuable, while questioning whether someone with her education and experience would be satisfied with available positions that offered limited opportunities for advancement. Most frustrating was the recurring suggestion that Olivia consider relocating to urban areas where auction houses and cultural institutions might value her expertise, advice that ignored the financial impossibility of moving when she couldn't afford current living expenses, let alone security deposits and moving costs required for establishing residence in expensive metropolitan areas where such opportunities might exist. The isolation that had accompanied Olivia's financial crisis was compounded by the well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful advice from friends and former colleagues who didn't understand the practical constraints of her situation. Suggestions to network with other appraisal professionals ignored the reality that most of her contacts were employed by institutions facing their own budget constraints and hiring freezes. Recommendations to pursue freelance consulting work overlooked the fact that such opportunities required existing client relationships and financial resources for business development that Olivia didn't possess. Even family support, while emotionally meaningful, couldn't address the practical challenges of Olivia's circumstances. Her brother Thomas's offer of temporary housing in Portland came with conditions that would require Olivia to abandon her job search efforts in Colorado while starting over in a city where she had no professional connections or familiarity with local cultural institutions. The decision represented choosing between maintaining some elements of the life she had built with Michael versus accepting help that would require abandoning everything familiar during an already traumatic period. More complex was Olivia's recognition that accepting family assistance might provide short-term stability while eliminating her independence and sense of agency during a period when regaining control over her circumstances felt essential for emotional recovery. The grief counseling sessions with Dr. Carson had emphasized the importance of maintaining some aspects of personal autonomy while addressing practical needs, a balance that seemed increasingly difficult to achieve as her options continued to narrow. The evening hours that Olivia now spent researching debt consolidation options and financial assistance programs had become exercises in confronting the inadequacy of social safety nets for people whose circumstances didn't fit standard categories of need. Her income exceeded eligibility thresholds for most assistance programs, while her debt levels exceeded the capacity of nonprofit credit counseling services to provide meaningful relief. The middle-class professional background that had once provided security now created obstacles to accessing help designed for people with different economic profiles. Most demoralizing was Olivia's discovery that the financial assistance programs available through local charitable organizations were designed primarily for temporary emergency relief rather than the comprehensive debt resolution that her situation required. Food pantries and utility assistance could address immediate needs, but couldn't prevent foreclosure or eliminate the accumulated debt that would continue creating financial pressure regardless of temporary support. The legal aid services available for foreclosure defense were similarly limited, offering guidance on procedural requirements and timeline extensions, but unable to provide alternatives that would allow Olivia to maintain home ownership without stable income sufficient to resume mortgage payments. The attorney she had consulted confirmed that her best option was negotiating terms for voluntary sale that might minimize credit damage while accepting the loss of her home and the equity she and Michael had built over 13 years of ownership. But it was during one of these depressing conversations with a housing counselor that Olivia first articulated the possibility she had been reluctant to consider directly. What if I use my remaining resources for something completely different? She had asked Maria Delgado, the nonprofit counselor who had been helping Olivia understand her foreclosure options. Instead of trying to delay the inevitable, what if I invested in an opportunity that might create income rather than just preserving what's left of my savings? Maria's response had been professionally cautious but personally understanding. Sometimes unconventional approaches make sense when conventional solutions haven't worked, she had acknowledged. But any investment would need to have realistic potential for generating income quickly enough to address your immediate needs while building longer-term stability. The time frame for recovery from your current situation requires solutions that can provide both immediate relief and sustainable improvement. The conversation had crystallized Olivia's recognition that incremental improvements to her current circumstances weren't sufficient to address the magnitude of her financial crisis. The part-time employment she had been able to secure provided income that was inadequate for maintaining housing costs, while the debt accumulated during Michael's illness would require years to resolve, even with significant improvement in her earning capacity. Conventional approaches to financial recovery assumed gradual progress over extended timeframes that didn't align with the urgent deadlines created by foreclosure proceedings and accumulating penalties. Perhaps more importantly, the conventional employment opportunities available to Olivia offered no connection to the professional expertise and personal interests that had defined her working life with Michael. The prospect of spending years in customer service or administrative roles while gradually paying down debt felt like accepting a diminished version of herself that honored neither her capabilities nor Michael's memory of their shared commitment to work that created cultural and educational value. The mine in Silver Cliff represented something entirely different, an opportunity that could potentially utilize her professional expertise while creating something meaningful that extended beyond merely personal financial recovery. Historic preservation work aligned with the values she and Michael had shared about protecting cultural heritage while contributing to community development. The project would be challenging and uncertain, but it would also be authentic to who she was and what she cared about in ways that conventional employment couldn't match. Yet acknowledging these emotional and professional attractions to the mining project didn't resolve the fundamental financial obstacles that made such an undertaking seem completely impractical. The $250 auction price represented her entire liquid assets, money that needed to cover essential expenses while she continued job searching and navigating foreclosure proceedings. Using those funds for property acquisition would eliminate her financial safety net during a period when unexpected expenses could create catastrophic consequences. The risk assessment was daunting regardless of how Olivia analyzed the decision. Purchasing the mine would commit her to property ownership responsibilities that could generate additional financial obligations through taxes, insurance, and emergency repairs while providing no immediate income or housing that could address her current crisis. The property's condition would require significant investment before generating any practical value, investment that Olivia had no realistic means of providing given her current circumstances. But as Olivia researched the mine's history and Silver Cliff's economic context throughout that week, she began to recognize that every decision available to her involved significant risks and uncertain outcomes. Continuing her current approach of part-time employment and gradual debt repayment offered no realistic path to financial stability given the magnitude of her obligations and limited earning potential in available positions. Accepting family assistance would provide short-term relief while potentially compromising her long-term independence and professional development. Perhaps the choice wasn't between a safe conventional approach and a risky unconventional opportunity, but rather between different types of risks that offered varying potential for meaningful improvement in her circumstances. The mine represented a risk that aligned with her professional expertise and personal values, while offering possibilities for creating something significant that could provide both financial and emotional returns. The other options available involved different risks that seemed more likely to lead to gradual diminishment of her capabilities and aspirations. By Tuesday evening, exactly 6 days after first seeing the auction listing, Olivia had made a decision that she couldn't entirely explain or justify through rational analysis. She would attend the auction the following morning, and if the bidding remained at the minimum level, she would purchase the mine with her remaining $250. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, representing either the worst possible choice she could make or the first authentic decision she had made since Michael's death. She spent that night surrounded by Michael's geological surveys and her own research files about frontier mining operations, drawing connections between his systematic approach to resource assessment and her understanding of historical preservation challenges. For the first time in months, Olivia felt engaged with work that utilized her expertise while honoring the collaborative approach she and Michael had brought to projects throughout their marriage. The woman who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations was suddenly energized by the complexity of developing preservation strategies for a historically significant property. The challenge felt manageable because it required skills she possessed and approaches she understood, even if the specific application was unfamiliar. Most importantly, it felt like moving toward possibilities rather than merely managing decline. As Olivia prepared for the auction, that would either represent the beginning of an extraordinary opportunity or the final mistake in a series of devastating financial decisions, she realized that she was finally making a choice based on hope rather than fear. The outcome was uncertain, but the direction felt authentic to everything she valued about creating meaningful work that honored both professional expertise and personal commitment to preserving cultural heritage for future generations. The drive to Silver Cliff on Wednesday morning took Olivia through mountain landscapes that she and Michael had explored during their early years in western Colorado, when weekend adventures had represented opportunities for discovery rather than desperate attempts to find alternatives to financial ruin. The 80-mile journey on winding mountain roads provided time for Olivia to question her decision repeatedly while simultaneously feeling more energized than she had experienced since Michael's death, as if moving toward an uncertain but authentic choice had restored some essential part of herself that months of survival-focused decision-making had gradually eroded. Silver Cliff appeared around a curve in Highway 67, exactly as Olivia remembered from that long-ago visit with Michael. A small mountain community nestled in a valley where Silver Creek created a natural pathway that had once supported mining operations and now hosted modest residential development. The town's main street stretched for 4 blocks along the old transportation corridor, lined with buildings that reflected both historical significance and the economic challenges facing many rural Colorado communities in the post-industrial era. The architectural integrity of Silver Cliff's downtown was immediately apparent to Olivia's trained eye, revealing a community that had maintained much of its late 19th and early 20th century built environment despite the economic pressures that had eliminated similar historic districts in other small towns throughout the region. The buildings showed various states of maintenance and occupancy, from carefully restored storefronts housing contemporary businesses to vacant structures that displayed "for sale" or "for lease" signs, indicating ongoing struggles to maintain commercial viability. But what struck Olivia most forcefully was the potential she could recognize in Silver Cliff's physical infrastructure and geographic setting, possibilities that seemed invisible to others but were obvious to someone with her background in understanding how historical assets could support contemporary economic development. The town's location provided convenient access to outdoor recreation opportunities that attracted increasing numbers of tourists, while its authentic historical character offered the type of cultural experience that heritage tourism initiatives were designed to promote. The mine property dominated a hillside visible from the town center. Its substantial stone structures, designed to accommodate the heavy equipment and worker housing that had justified the operation's expansion during the 1870s economic boom. Despite decades of abandonment, the structures retained the imposing presence that frontier-era builders had intended for industrial buildings that symbolized progress and prosperity. During the optimistic years following the Civil War, Olivia parked near the county courthouse where the auction was scheduled and spent several minutes studying the mine property through binoculars before the proceedings began, noting details that weren't visible in the online listing photographs. The main building's foundation appeared solid, constructed from locally quarried stone that had weathered well despite decades of neglect. The upper walls showed some deterioration where wooden elements had been exposed to harsh mountain weather, but the overall structural integrity seemed sound based on her visual assessment from a distance. Most encouraging was the survival of architectural details that indicated quality craftsmanship throughout the property's construction. The stonework around doorways and windows featured patterns and textures that demonstrated skilled masonry, while the surviving wooden elements displayed the sturdy construction that characterized substantial industrial buildings from the 1870s. These elements represented significant value that would be expensive to recreate if damaged or destroyed, their preservation both historically important and economically advantageous for any restoration effort. The setting itself provided advantages that Olivia hadn't fully appreciated from the auction listing description. The mine's hillside location offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains, while providing natural drainage that had protected the main structures from the water damage that often accelerated deterioration in abandoned properties. The access road, though overgrown with vegetation, remained visible and could potentially be restored without major engineering work, creating vehicle access that could support restoration activities and eventual visitor services. More intriguingly, Olivia noticed that several buildings in Silver Cliff showed signs of recent renovation and new business development, suggesting economic activity that might support additional ventures. A newly opened craft brewery, a small boutique hotel, and an outdoor equipment retailer indicated entrepreneurial energy and tourist interest that could provide market demand for appropriately developed cultural or recreational space if the mine could be restored to functional condition. The county auction was scheduled to begin at 10:00 a.m. in the courthouse meeting room, with the mining property listed as the second item in a series of tax-delinquent properties being sold to recover unpaid obligations. Olivia arrived early to observe the process and assess potential competition from other bidders who might be interested in the property, though she recognized that her $250 limit would quickly be exceeded if serious developers or investors participated in the bidding. The small group of attendees gathering for the auction appeared to consist primarily of local residents, curious about the proceedings rather than potential purchasers with specific interest in acquiring property. Olivia counted fewer than 15 people, most of whom seemed to know each other and were engaged in conversations about community issues rather than property acquisition strategies. The casual atmosphere suggested limited commercial interest in the available properties, potentially creating favorable conditions for someone willing to bid on unconventional real estate. County auctioneer Robert Jenkins began the proceedings with bureaucratic efficiency, explaining legal requirements and liability limitations, while emphasizing that all properties were being sold as is, with no warranties regarding condition, environmental compliance, or development potential. The disclaimers were extensive and somewhat intimidating, reminding purchasers that they would assume complete responsibility for addressing any problems or violations associated with their acquisitions. The first property, a small commercial lot with foundation remnants, attracted minimal interest and sold for an amount close to its minimum bid, suggesting that Olivia's assessment about limited competition might be accurate. When Jenkins announced the mine property, describing it as approximately 2 acres with mining structures built in 1873, requiring significant restoration, minimum bid $250, Olivia felt her heart rate increase despite her preparation for this moment. "Do I hear $250? Jenkins called, scanning the small crowd for initial interest. Olivia raised her bidding card with a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and completely foreign, representing the first time she had ever bid on real estate and possibly the most impulsive financial decision she had made since her teenage years. The auctioneer acknowledged her bid while looking for competing offers that didn't materialize from the other attendees. "I have $250, looking for $300, Jenkins continued, allowing sufficient time for response before advancing through the traditional auction sequence. $250 going once, $250 going twice. Olivia held her breath, recognizing that she was moments away from either purchasing a historic property or losing the opportunity that had captured her imagination during the previous week of research and soul-searching. "Sold, lot number 4. For $250, Jenkins announced with professional matter-of-factness, already consulting his paperwork for the next property while Olivia struggled to process what had just occurred. She had purchased a 150-year-old mining operation with her last $250, a decision that represented either remarkable courage or spectacular foolishness, depending on perspectives she wasn't prepared to consider at that moment. The paperwork processing required another hour at the county administrative office, where Olivia learned additional details about the property that hadn't been included in the auction listing. The purchase included not only the visible structures, but also mineral rights to the 2 acres, creating potential value beyond merely restoring the existing buildings. More significantly, the property was already listed on the Colorado State Historic Register, providing access to preservation grants and tax credits that could help offset restoration costs. County Clerk Patricia Wilson explained these benefits while processing Olivia's purchase documents, noting that historic designation could provide substantial financial advantages for preservation projects, while creating restrictions on modifications that would require approval from state historical agencies. "The designation is both an asset and a constraint," Wilson explained. "It opens funding opportunities, but limits what changes you can make to the property's historical features." Olivia signed the deed transfer documents while part of her mind marveled at the surreal experience of becoming a property owner through an investment that represented everything she had left after Michael's death and their financial catastrophe. The transaction felt simultaneously momentous and anticlimactic, requiring only routine paperwork to transfer ownership of a property that might become either the foundation for rebuilding her life or an additional burden that would accelerate her financial collapse. But as Olivia drove back to Durango that afternoon, she experienced a sense of purpose and excitement that had been absent from her life since Michael's illness had begun transforming their shared future into a series of devastating losses. For the first time in months, she was moving toward possibilities rather than merely attempting to minimize damage from circumstances beyond her control. The mine represented opportunity rather than obligation, potential rather than problems that required management through careful limitation of expectations. The property's historical significance provided intellectual engagement that connected with Olivia's professional expertise while offering practical applications that could create economic value beyond academic appreciation. Her graduate research on frontier mining operations had examined exactly the type of property she had just purchased, providing knowledge that could inform restoration decisions, while identifying historical features that should be preserved or researched for their documentary value. More personally, the mine project represented continuation of the collaborative approach to meaningful work that she and Michael had planned to pursue during retirement, when his geological expertise and her historical knowledge could be combined for preservation projects that created cultural and educational benefits for communities like Silver Cliff. While Michael couldn't participate directly, the values and approaches they had developed together could guide Olivia's work in ways that honored their partnership while creating something significant that extended beyond personal recovery. That evening, Olivia spread her research materials about the mine and Silver Cliff's history across her kitchen table, creating a workspace that felt familiar and energizing after months of focusing on survival rather than creative problem-solving. Her academic training had emphasized the importance of thorough research before beginning any preservation project, understanding not only the property's architectural significance, but also its role in community development and regional economic history. The mine's construction in 1873 had coincided with the expansion of mineral extraction into Colorado's mountain counties, part of a broader effort to develop natural resources that could support industrial growth while providing economic opportunities for settlers moving westward after the Civil War. The timing placed the property within the post-Civil War expansion period when frontier communities were establishing infrastructure and economic systems that connected isolated settlements with eastern markets. Olivia's research revealed that the Silver Cliff mine had been financed through a combination of private investment and government land grants designed to encourage resource development in mountainous regions where construction costs exceeded potential profits without government incentives. The engineering challenges of building mining operations in Rocky Mountain terrain had required innovative solutions and substantial financial resources, making the Silver Cliff mine a significant investment that reflected confidence in the region's mineral potential. The architectural design of the property incorporated elements typical of frontier mining operations from the 1870s, including functional industrial spaces, worker housing, and administrative offices that reflected the social hierarchy and operational requirements of 19th-century resource extraction. Understanding this historical context was essential for developing preservation approaches that acknowledge the property's complete history, while creating educational opportunities that addressed both technological innovation and labor conditions with appropriate sensitivity and accuracy. More encouraging for restoration planning was Olivia's discovery that the mine had been designed by engineer William T. Morgan, whose firm had specialized in mining structures throughout the Rocky Mountains during the late 19th century. Morgan's designs were known for incorporating high-quality materials and craftsmanship that had enabled many of his buildings to survive decades of use and abandonment, suggesting that the Silver Cliff property might be in better condition than its exterior appearance indicated. The historical documentation Olivia was able to locate included original engineering drawings and construction specifications that could guide restoration work while ensuring compliance with historical preservation standards required for properties listed on state and federal historic registers. These materials represented invaluable resources that could prevent costly mistakes while helping secure grants and tax credits available for projects that maintained architectural integrity according to professional preservation standards. But perhaps most intriguing was Olivia's discovery of references to the mine's role during the final years of the Civil War, when Confederate interests had attempted to establish Western operations that could continue functioning if Southern states were defeated. Several historical accounts mention Silver Cliff as a location where Confederate sympathizers had invested in mining operations that could potentially support continued resistance through resource generation and supply chain development. These references were fragmentary and required additional research to verify their accuracy, but they suggested that the property might have historical significance. extending beyond its architectural and industrial heritage. If documented evidence could be located proving Confederate connections to Silver Cliff, the property's historical value would increase substantially while potentially attracting research interest from civil, war historians and preservation organizations. With resources for supporting significant archaeological and historical investigation, the possibility added another dimension to Olivia's growing recognition of the mine's potential value beyond merely physical restoration of abandoned structures. Olivia's next step was developing a comprehensive preservation plan that would address both immediate stabilization needs and longer-term restoration goals. Her research identified several funding mechanisms that could potentially support different aspects of the project, including historic preservation tax credits, heritage tourism grants, and environmental remediation funds designed specifically for former mining sites. Understanding these financial mechanisms required expertise that Olivia didn't possess, but her research identified consultants and organizations that specialized in structuring historic preservation projects to maximize available incentives while ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements. The professional fees for such services represented additional expenses, but the potential returns justified investment in proper planning and documentation that could secure substantial financial benefits. By the end of her first week as mine owner, Olivia had developed preliminary preservation strategies that addressed both immediate safety concerns and longer-term restoration goals. The most urgent priorities involved securing the structures against further weather damage and conducting professional structural assessments that would inform decisions about renovation approaches and budget requirements. The basic stabilization work needed to prevent additional deterioration would cost approximately $7,500, according to estimates from local contractors, an amount that exceeded Olivia's available resources, but could potentially be financed through emergency preservation grants designed to prevent loss of historically significant structures. Her applications for such funding would require documentation that she was developing through photographic surveys and historical research that demonstrated the property's significance. More comprehensive restoration work would require substantially larger investments, but Olivia's research had identified multiple funding sources that could support different phases of the project, if properly coordinated through strategic planning and phased implementation. The key was developing approaches that created immediate benefits while building toward larger goals that could attract ongoing financial support from various sources. Most importantly, Olivia's week of intensive preservation research had restored her sense of professional competence and personal agency in ways that months of job searching and debt management had gradually eroded. Working on challenges that utilized her expertise while creating something meaningful for both personal and community benefit provided psychological benefits that transcended merely financial considerations, though financial sustainability remained essential for any long-term success. The mine project was beginning to feel like exactly the type of work she and Michael had planned to pursue together, combining historical preservation with community development while creating educational opportunities that honored cultural heritage. While Michael couldn't participate directly, the approaches and values they had developed together could guide Olivia's work in ways that maintained connection to their shared vision while adapting to her current circumstances and capabilities. As Olivia prepared for the next phase of her preservation work, she recognized that purchasing the mine had already transformed her relationship to her financial crisis in fundamental ways. Instead of merely managing decline and minimizing losses, she was actively working toward creating value and opportunity that could provide both personal stability and community benefits. The shift from survival mode to development mode had restored her sense of agency and professional identity in ways that conventional employment opportunities couldn't have achieved. The challenges ahead were substantial and uncertain, But they were challenges that required her expertise and aligned with her values, rather than problems that made her feel professionally irrelevant and personally diminished. For the first time since Michael's death, Olivia was excited about the future rather than merely anxious about avoiding catastrophic outcomes. The mine had become not just a property project, but a pathway toward rebuilding her life according to principles that honored both her professional capabilities and personal commitment to creating something meaningful that extended beyond individual circumstances. The first morning Olivia entered the mine property as its legal owner, she experienced a complex mixture of exhilaration and terror that accurately reflected the magnitude of what she had committed herself to achieving. The property's main structure, revealed in natural light filtering through broken windows, displayed both the architectural quality that justified her investment and the overwhelming scope of work that would be required to transform potential into reality. The main building stretched 60 feet in length with 18-foot ceilings that created an impressively spacious environment despite the accumulated debris and structural damage that marked decades of neglect. The original stone walls, though weathered and cracked in places, remained fundamentally sound and displayed the solid construction that was characteristic of quality frontier-era industrial buildings. More remarkably, many of the property's industrial elements had survived better than Olivia had expected from her distant assessment. Several pieces of mining equipment remained in place, including a winch system, ore cart tracks, and processing machinery that retained enough integrity to guide accurate restoration. The administrative office featured built-in cabinetry with brass hardware that had developed a beautiful patina beneath layers of dust and grime, while the worker housing area contained furniture pieces that appeared to have been abandoned in place when operations ended in 1935. These artifacts represented both historical objects that enhanced the property's significance and practical elements that could support contemporary interpretive uses if properly restored and maintained. But the mine's condition also revealed challenges that would require immediate attention before any restoration work could proceed effectively. Structural damage to roof systems and support beams had created safety hazards that would need professional assessment and repair before other renovation work could begin safely. The electrical system, installed sometime during the early 1900s, was completely inadequate for modern usage and would require total replacement, according to current codes and safety standards. More concerning was evidence of wildlife intrusion through broken windows and deteriorated exterior walls, creating health and safety issues that would need addressing before Olivia could spend extended time on the property or allow others to visit for assessment and planning purposes. The underground portions of the mine, originally used for ore extraction, had been sealed decades earlier, but would require professional evaluation to ensure stability and environmental safety. Despite these obvious challenges, Olivia felt energized, rather than overwhelmed, as she documented the property's condition through systematic photography and notes that would support grant applications and contractor estimates. Her appraisal training had taught her to assess artifacts and architectural elements for both their current condition and restoration potential, analyzing how damaged components could be stabilized or replicated to maintain historical integrity while ensuring structural soundness. The process of documentation transformed what might have appeared to others as an overwhelming collection of problems into a structured inventory of preservation challenges that could be addressed through methodical planning and strategic implementation. This approach had been fundamental to her appraisal work, where systematic evaluation replaced emotional reactions with professional assessment, creating pathways to authentic preservation that honored historical significance while acknowledging practical limitations. Olivia's research identified several regional firms that specialized in historic preservation of mining properties, including Morgan Preservation Services, whose founder James Morgan was the great-grandson of William T. Morgan, the engineer who had designed the Silver Cliff Mine. This family connection created both historical continuity and practical advantages, since Morgan Preservation maintained archives of original engineering drawings and construction specifications for many of their ancestors' projects throughout the Rocky Mountains. The consultation with James Morgan provided Olivia's first professional assessment of the mine's condition and restoration requirements, confirming her optimistic evaluation of the property's structural integrity, while identifying specific priorities for preservation work. Morgan's estimate for comprehensive restoration ranged from $120,000 to $180,000. Depending on the level of historical accuracy desired and the extent of public access accommodations incorporated into the final design. The good news is that your property is fundamentally solid, Morgan explained during their initial meeting. William T. Morgan designed these mining operations to last, and the quality of construction has protected the structures despite decades of deferred maintenance. The challenging news is that proper restoration will require significant investment in specialized materials and techniques that ensure historical authenticity while meeting contemporary safety codes. The cost estimates were daunting, but not entirely unexpected given Olivia's research about historic preservation projects. More encouraging was Morgan's assessment that the work could be phased to address critical issues first while building toward comprehensive restoration as funding became available. The immediate priority was stabilizing the roof systems and addressing structural issues that were causing ongoing damage to interior components and walls. Morgan's company could complete emergency stabilization work for approximately $14,000, which would prevent further deterioration while providing time to secure funding for more comprehensive restoration phases. The estimate exceeded Olivia's available resources, but it represented a manageable first step that would protect her investment, while demonstrating commitment to preservation that could strengthen grant applications and partnership proposals. Olivia's financing strategy involved combining multiple funding sources to support different aspects of the restoration work while maintaining flexibility to adapt plans based on available resources and emerging opportunities. Her research had identified 9 potential funding programs that could provide grants, tax credits, or low-interest loans for qualifying historic preservation projects, each with different requirements and evaluation criteria that would need careful coordination. The most promising immediate opportunity was the Colorado Emergency Historic Preservation Fund, which provided grants up to $20,000 for critical stabilization work on properties facing imminent threat of loss due to structural deterioration or environmental damage. Olivia's application emphasized the mine's architectural significance and community importance while documenting the urgent need for structural repairs that would prevent irreversible damage to historically significant features. The application process required extensive documentation that Olivia was uniquely qualified to provide given her appraisal background and academic training in historical research methods. Her submission included architectural photography, historical research demonstrating the property's significance, letters of support from local officials and preservation organizations, and detailed technical specifications for proposed stabilization. Work that met professional preservation standards. More complex, but potentially more valuable, was Olivia's application for historic tax credits that could provide up to $65,000 in federal and state credits based on Morgan's restoration cost estimates. The tax credit program required pre-approval of restoration plans and ongoing compliance monitoring, but offered substantial financial benefits that could make comprehensive restoration economically feasible if properly structured and managed. Olivia's tax credit application required collaboration with specialized attorneys and accountants who understood the regulatory requirements and structuring options for maximizing available benefits. The professional fees for this expertise represented additional expenses, but the potential returns justified investment in proper planning that could secure substantial financial advantages while ensuring compliance with complex federal and state regulations. Simultaneously, Olivia was developing partnership proposals for academic institutions and cultural organizations that might provide resources and expertise in exchange for research access and educational programming opportunities. Her outreach to Colorado State University's public history program had generated interest from faculty members who specialized in mining history and material culture studies related to 19th century resource development. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, who directed CSU's historic preservation program, visited the mine during Olivia's second week of ownership and immediately recognized both the property's research potential and Olivia's qualifications for managing a significant preservation project. This is exactly the type of community-based preservation work that our students need experience with, Dr. Reynolds explained. We could potentially provide graduate student researchers and preservation specialists in exchange for case study access and fieldwork opportunities. The university partnership could provide substantial value through student labor, faculty expertise, and access to specialized equipment and resources that would be expensive to obtain commercially. Graduate students in historic preservation and public history programs needed hands-on experience with real preservation projects, while faculty researchers could pursue academic interests in mining history and regional economic development using the Silver Cliff property as a primary source. More significantly, university involvement would enhance Olivia's credibility with funding agencies and preservation organizations that evaluated projects based on professional expertise and institutional support. Academic partnerships demonstrated serious commitment to preservation standards and educational outcomes that aligned with the public benefits that most grant programs were designed to achieve. Olivia's outreach to tourism and economic development organizations had revealed additional partnership opportunities that could provide both resources and markets for mine programming, once restoration was sufficiently advanced to allow safe public access. The Rocky Mountain Heritage Trail Organization was particularly interested in adding the Silver Cliff Mine to their promotional materials and interpretive programming, potentially bringing hundreds of visitors annually to the site, if appropriate facilities could be developed. The Heritage Trail Director, Sarah McKenzie, visited the property during Olivia's third week of ownership and outlined potential collaboration that could include grant assistance, marketing support, and program development if Olivia could create safe visitor access and basic interpretive displays. What you have here represents exactly the type of authentic mining heritage that our visitors are seeking, McKenzie explained. The combination of well-preserved structures and your expertise in frontier history could create a distinctive experience that would complement our existing sites while strengthening Silver Cliff's position as a heritage tourism destination. The tourism partnership offered potential earned revenue that could support ongoing operations once initial restoration was completed, creating sustainable funding that could reduce dependence on grants and donations while providing Olivia with personal income sufficient to address her ongoing financial obligations. The market research conducted by Heritage Trail suggested that properly developed historical sites in the region could generate between $30,000 and $80,000 annually in admission fees, program revenue, and merchandise sales, depending on location, accessibility, and marketing effectiveness. As these potential partnerships developed, Olivia continued her detailed documentation and research work on the property, systematically examining each building component and artifact, while developing preservation plans that would maintain historical integrity while creating sustainable uses. The process was labor-intensive but deeply satisfying, utilizing her professional expertise while creating tangible progress toward restoration goals that seemed increasingly achievable despite initial financial limitations. Most encouragingly, Olivia's emergency preservation grant application had received preliminary approval, with funding committee members expressing particular interest in the property's potential connections to Civil War history. The committee had requested additional documentation of these historical associations, creating an opportunity for Olivia to expand her research into archival materials that might verify the fragmentary references she had discovered in initial investigations. The university partnership was advancing through formal agreement negotiations that would provide student researchers and faculty supervision for historical investigation and documentation work beginning in the spring semester. The collaboration would include archaeological assessment of the mine site, oral history collection from community members who remembered stories about the property's operational period, and archival research to document the structure's role in regional mining development and potential Civil War connections. More immediately, Olivia had secured commitments from local volunteers who would assist with cleaning and basic maintenance work that would prepare the property for professional restoration activities. The volunteer labor would provide significant cost savings while building community investment in the project's success and creating opportunities for skills development and historical education among participants. Most crucially, Olivia's preservation planning had identified realistic pathways for financing restoration work through combinations of grants, tax credits, and earned revenue that could provide both project funding and personal income during the extended period required for comprehensive renovation. The financial projections were optimistic, but based on careful research and professional consultation that provided confidence in their achievability. The mine project was beginning to feel like exactly the type of meaningful work that Olivia had been seeking since Michael's death, utilizing her professional expertise while creating something valuable for both personal recovery and community development. The challenges were substantial, but they were challenges that required capabilities she possessed, rather than skills she needed to develop or compromises that diminished her sense of professional identity and personal values. Perhaps most importantly, Olivia's commitment to mine restoration had restored her sense of agency and purpose during a period when external circumstances had seemed to eliminate most possibilities for meaningful choice or positive change. Instead of merely responding to financial pressures and employment limitations, she was actively creating opportunities that aligned with her expertise and values while contributing to preservation of cultural heritage that extended beyond individual circumstances. The transformation from desperate job seeker to preservation project manager had occurred gradually but fundamentally, reflecting both Olivia's professional capabilities and her willingness to pursue unconventional approaches when conventional solutions proved inadequate. The mine had become not just a property restoration project, but a vehicle for rebuilding her life according to principles that honored both her relationship with Michael and her commitment to work that created lasting value for communities and future generations. As Olivia prepared for the next phase of preservation work, which would involve implementing emergency stabilization measures while continuing to develop funding partnerships and community relationships, she recognized that purchasing the mine had already achieved something essential for her: recovery from the compounded losses that had defined the previous 2 years. She was no longer merely surviving circumstances beyond her control, but actively creating possibilities that reflected her expertise, values, and commitment to building something meaningful from what others had abandoned as worthless. The leap of faith represented by spending her last $250 on an abandoned mining property was proving to be exactly the type of authentic decision that could create genuine alternatives to the diminished expectations and limited opportunities that had seemed to define her available choices. Sometimes the most rational decision was to make choices based on values and capabilities rather than fears and limitations, even when the immediate outcomes remained uncertain and the challenges appeared overwhelming to external observers who couldn't recognize the expertise and determination that made seemingly impossible projects achievable. 4 weeks into her mine restoration project, Olivia was documenting structural damage in the property's administrative building when her flashlight illuminated something that would transform not only her personal circumstances, but the entire understanding of Civil War history in the Western Territories. What appeared to be an irregularity in the stone foundation wall revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be the edge of a carefully concealed metal door set flush with the masonry and covered by decades of accumulated dirt and mineral deposits. The discovery occurred during Olivia's methodical survey of the building's lower level, work that was required for her historic tax credit application and emergency preservation grant proposals. Her appraisal training had taught her to examine architectural features systematically, noting not only obvious elements but also anomalies that might indicate historical modifications or hidden structural components. The administrative building's stonework appeared consistent throughout, except for a section near the structure's eastern corner, where the mortar pattern seemed slightly different from surrounding areas. Olivia's initial assumption was that she had discovered evidence of later repairs or utility installations that had modified the original foundation, common occurrences in buildings that had been adapted for changing uses over their operational lifespans. But as she cleaned away accumulated debris and examined the area more carefully, the metal surface became apparent, revealing what was clearly a purpose-built access point rather than a random modification or repair. The concealed door measured approximately 24 inches square and featured a robust latch mechanism that had been protected from corrosion by its sealed environment within the stonework. Unlike the building's other metal components, which showed significant rust damage from decades of exposure to mountain weather, the hidden door's hardware appeared to be in remarkably good condition, suggesting that it had been designed for long-term preservation rather than regular access. Olivia's heart rate increased as she recognized the potential historical significance of her discovery. Hidden compartments and concealed storage areas were not uncommon in 19th-century mining operations, particularly in remote locations where security concerns often led to creation of secure storage for valuable materials, payroll funds, and important documents. Her graduate research had included documentation of similar features in industrial buildings throughout the region, though she had never expected to encounter such elements in her own preservation work. Before proceeding with any investigation of the concealed compartment, Olivia recognized the importance of proper documentation and professional consultation. Historic preservation protocols required careful recording of any discoveries that might have archaeological or historical significance, especially when those discoveries could potentially alter understanding of a property's original functions or historical associations. Olivia's first call was to Dr. Reynolds at Colorado State University, whose preservation expertise and academic credentials would provide both practical guidance and scholarly legitimacy to whatever investigation might follow. "You've potentially found something extraordinary," Dr. Reynolds said after Olivia described her discovery in detail. "Don't attempt to open the compartment until we can assemble a proper documentation team. This could have significant historical implications, especially given the potential Civil War connections you've been researching." Within 48 hours, Dr. Reynolds had arranged for a small team of preservation specialists and archaeologists to visit the Silver Cliff mine, bringing specialized equipment and documentation protocols that would ensure whatever the hidden compartment contained would be properly preserved and recorded. The team included Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, a historian specializing in Confederate activities in Western territories during the Civil War, whose research had identified potential connections between Southern interests and Colorado mining operations during the 1860s. If your discovery confirms these connections, it would provide the first physical evidence of what has been largely speculative history, Dr. Harrison explained as the team prepared their equipment. There are documentary suggestions that Confederate sympathizers established mining operations in Western territories as contingency plans for continuing Southern economic activities if the war was lost. but we've never had archaeological confirmation of these activities. The documentation process began with detailed photography and measurements of the concealed door and surrounding stonework, creating a comprehensive record of the discovery in its undisturbed state. Specialized lighting revealed subtle tool marks and construction techniques that indicated the compartment had been built during the property's original construction rather than added later, suggesting it was part of the mine's intended design, rather than a modification for later purposes. Dr. Reynolds supervised the process, ensuring that proper archaeological protocols were followed while recognizing the potential historical significance of whatever the compartment might contain. We're establishing a complete chain of documentation from discovery through investigation, he explained to Olivia. This approach ensures that whatever we find will have maximum historical and scholarly value while protecting the integrity of both the physical artifacts and their contextual significance. The team's careful preparation revealed how thoroughly Olivia's preservation work had already transformed her relationship to the property from merely owning an abandoned mine to becoming the steward of potentially significant historical resources. The professionals treated her as a colleague rather than simply a property owner, acknowledging her expertise while providing specialized knowledge that enhanced her understanding of proper preservation approaches. The compartment's opening requires careful coordination between preservation and archaeological protocols, Dr. Harrison explained as the team prepared their tools. We need to ensure that any contents are properly documented while maintaining the historical integrity of both the storage area and any artifacts it might contain. Dr. Reynolds supervised the process, using specialized tools and documentation methods that would preserve the discovery's research value regardless of what might be found inside the concealed space. The metal door opened with surprising ease, its hinges and latch mechanism protected from deterioration by their sealed environment within the stonework. As the door swung outward, the team's headlamps illuminated a space that had remained undisturbed. Since the 19th century, the compartment revealed a stone-lined chamber approximately 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, constructed with the same high-quality masonry that characterized the mine's foundation work. The space had remained completely dry despite the property's exposure to harsh mountain weather, suggesting that its builders had anticipated long-term storage requirements and designed the compartment to protect valuable contents from environmental damage over extended periods. Most remarkably, the chamber contained a collection of wooden crates and metal containers that appeared to have been placed there deliberately and left undisturbed since the Civil War era. The containers showed minimal deterioration, their contents protected by the sealed environment that had preserved them in near-original condition for more than 150 years. Dr. Harrison's careful removal and documentation of the containers revealed contents that exceeded even the team's optimistic expectations about their potential historical significance. The wooden crates contained hundreds of gold and silver coins bearing Confederate government markings, while the metal containers held government bonds, treasury notes, and official documents that provided unprecedented documentation of Confederate financial operations during the war's Western expansion efforts. But the most extraordinary discovery was a leather portfolio containing detailed records of Confederate Treasury movements through Colorado Territory, including specific documentation of assets deposited at the Silver Cliff location during 1863, when Confederate officials had attempted to establish secure repositories for government resources beyond the reach of Union forces. The records included signatures of Treasury officials, detailed inventories of deposited assets, and maps showing the locations of other concealed repositories throughout Western territories. "This is absolutely unprecedented," Dr. Harrison whispered, as she examined the Treasury records with white cotton gloves. These documents provide direct evidence for understanding how Confederate government assets were distributed in Western territories during the war. We're looking at primary source evidence that historians have been seeking for more than a century. The gold and silver coins alone represented substantial monetary value, with preliminary estimates suggesting a total worth exceeding $3.7 million at current precious metal prices. But the historical significance of the discovery transcended its monetary value, providing documentation that would require rewriting textbooks about Confederate government operations in Western territories during the Civil War. More personally, significant for Olivia was the legal determination that the discovered assets belonged to her as the property owner, since they had been abandoned for more than 150 years and represented Confederate government property that had no surviving legal claimants. While various government agencies and academic institutions expressed interest in studying and preserving the materials, Olivia's ownership rights were clearly established under Colorado property law and federal precedents regarding abandoned historical assets. The discovery transformed Olivia's financial circumstances virtually overnight, eliminating her debt obligations while providing resources that could support not only complete mine restoration but also establishment of a significant museum and research center focused on Civil War history and mining heritage. The monetary value of the Confederate Treasury assets was sufficient to fund comprehensive restoration work while creating an endowment that would ensure long-term operational sustainability. But perhaps more importantly, the discovery validated Olivia's decision to pursue an unconventional approach to addressing her financial crisis, demonstrating that her expertise and instincts had led her to recognize value that others had overlooked. For decades, the mine that county officials had considered a liability requiring minimal auction value had revealed itself to be one of the most significant archaeological sites in Colorado, containing primary source materials that would reshape academic understanding of Civil War history in Western territories. The media attention that followed the discovery's announcement created national interest in Olivia's story, transforming her from struggling widow to acclaimed preservationist, whose intuitive recognition of historical significance had led to extraordinary archaeological discoveries. Television interviews, newspaper features, and magazine articles shared her journey from financial desperation to historical preservation success, inspiring others who face similar challenges to consider unconventional approaches to creating opportunities from seemingly impossible circumstances. The publicity also generated substantial interest in visiting the mine once restoration work was completed, with tourism officials projecting that the site could attract more than 45,000 visitors annually based on the historical significance of the Confederate Treasury discovery and the broader appeal of authentic mining heritage sites throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The tourism potential provided sustainable revenue projections that could support ongoing operations while contributing to Silver Cliff's economic development through visitor spending and related business growth. Olivia's restoration work proceeded with resources and expertise that exceeded anything she could have imagined when purchasing the property with her last $250. Her historic tax credit application was expedited given the discovery's national significance, while additional preservation grants provided funding for specialized conservation work that would properly preserve and display the Confederate Treasury materials according to museum standards. The Colorado State University partnership expanded to include collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution and leading Civil War research centers that recognize the mine site as providing unique opportunities for interdisciplinary research, combining history, archaeology, and preservation studies. Graduate students and faculty researchers from throughout the country requested access to the site and materials for thesis projects and scholarly publications that would advance academic understanding while creating educational programming for public access. Most meaningfully for Olivia, the mine project had evolved into exactly the type of collaborative work that she and Michael had envisioned pursuing together, combining historical preservation with community development while creating educational opportunities that honored cultural heritage for future generations. While Michael couldn't participate directly, the values and approaches they had developed together guided every aspect of the project in ways that maintained connection to their shared vision while adapting to circumstances that neither could have anticipated. The Silver Cliff Mine Museum and Research Center opened 20 months after Olivia's initial discovery, featuring exhibitions that told the complete story of the property's construction, operational history, abandonment, and archaeological significance. Within the broader context of Civil War history and Western mining development, the museum's programming included educational initiatives for regional schools, research facilities for visiting scholars, and community events that connected residents with their local heritage while attracting visitors from throughout the country. Olivia's role as museum director utilized every aspect of her professional training while providing the type of meaningful work that had motivated her original interest in historical appraisal and authentication. Her expertise in frontier artifacts, experience with collections management, and understanding of educational programming proved directly applicable to developing exhibitions and programs that made complex historical information accessible to diverse audiences while maintaining scholarly accuracy and research value. The museum's success created broader opportunities for Olivia's expertise in historic preservation and museum development, leading to consulting work with other communities throughout Colorado and neighboring states that wanted to develop heritage tourism attractions based on their historical assets. Her experience with the mine project provided credibility and practical knowledge that proved valuable for advising other preservation efforts, while creating additional income streams that enhanced her financial security. But perhaps most importantly, Olivia's journey from financial desperation to professional fulfillment demonstrated the potential for authentic decisions based on expertise and values to create opportunities that transcended immediate circumstances and conventional expectations. Her willingness to risk everything on preserving something that others had written off as worthless had revealed not only hidden treasure, but also possibilities for creating meaningful work that honored both personal heritage and community needs. 5 years after purchasing the mine with her last $250, Olivia welcomed her 150,000th museum visitor, a milestone that represented the transformation of both her personal circumstances and Silver Cliff's identity as a destination for heritage, tourism, and historical education. The celebration included representatives from major universities, preservation organizations, and government agencies that had supported the mine's restoration while recognizing its significance for understanding Civil War history and demonstrating best practices for community-based preservation work. During her remarks at the anniversary celebration, Olivia reflected on the journey that had begun with Michael's illness and financial catastrophe, continued through desperate decisions and unconventional choices, and resulted in discoveries that exceeded anything she could have imagined when facing foreclosure and professional irrelevance. Sometimes our worst circumstances create the conditions for recognizing opportunities that we might never have considered during more comfortable times, she observed. Sometimes what appears to be our biggest mistake becomes the doorway to possibilities we couldn't have planned or predicted. The mine that had seemed like an impulsive waste of her last financial resources had become the foundation for a career that utilized all of her professional expertise while creating economic and educational benefits that extended far beyond individual recovery. The Confederate Treasury discovery had provided financial security, but the preservation work itself had restored Olivia's sense of purpose and professional identity in ways that money alone couldn't have achieved. Most remarkably, Olivia's success with the mine project had inspired similar preservation efforts throughout western Colorado, as other communities recognized that their overlooked historical assets might contain both cultural significance and economic potential that could support sustainable development while preserving regional heritage for future generations. The mine had become a model for community-based preservation work that demonstrated how individual initiative could create broader benefits when aligned with professional expertise and community support. Olivia's story had become an inspiration for others facing similar challenges, showing that authentic decisions based on values and capabilities rather than fears and limitations could create genuine alternatives to diminished expectations and constrained opportunities. The widow who had once faced financial ruin and professional irrelevance had become a nationally recognized expert in historic preservation whose work contributed to both scholarly understanding and community development throughout the region. Beyond the professional recognition and financial security, Olivia had achieved something more valuable: the restoration of hope and agency that had seemed permanently lost during the darkest period following Michael's death. The mine project had provided not just economic recovery but personal renewal that honored both her individual capabilities and the collaborative values she had shared with Michael throughout their marriage. As Olivia looked toward the future, she recognized that the mine's transformation from abandoned liability to nationally significant museum represented only the beginning of possibilities that could emerge when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances to recognize hidden value in what others had dismissed as worthless. Sometimes the most important discoveries required not just expertise and resources, but the courage to act on conviction when conventional wisdom suggested that such action was foolish or impossible. The mining property that had once symbolized a community's lost connections to broader economic opportunities had become a symbol of how individual determination, combined with professional expertise, could revive not just buildings but entire communities while preserving cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost to neglect in changing economic circumstances. Olivia's leap of faith had proved that sometimes the most rational decision was to trust in values and capabilities rather than limitations and fears, even when the immediate outcomes remained uncertain and the challenges appeared overwhelming. To observers who couldn't recognize the expertise and commitment that made seemingly impossible achievements possible, the Silver Cliff Mine Museum now anchored a thriving heritage tourism economy that supported dozens of local businesses while providing educational opportunities for thousands of visitors. Annually, the property that the county had auctioned for $250 as a tax liability had generated more than $12 million in regional economic impact over 5 years, creating jobs, tax revenue, and community pride while preserving an important chapter of American history that might otherwise have been lost to deterioration and neglect. More personally, Olivia had transformed her own story from one of devastating loss and financial catastrophe to a narrative of resilience, professional achievement, and meaningful contribution to historical understanding. The desperate widow, facing foreclosure and unemployment, had become the visionary preservationist whose expertise and determination had revealed historical treasures while creating educational resources for future generations. As she concluded her remarks at the anniversary celebration, Olivia acknowledged the many partners and supporters who had contributed to the museum's success, while emphasizing that the project's most important lesson was about recognizing value and potential in unexpected places. The greatest treasures are often hidden in what others consider worthless, she noted. Sometimes our greatest opportunities appear disguised as impossible challenges, and our most valuable resources are the expertise and values that help us recognize possibilities where others see only problems. The audience's standing ovation reflected not just appreciation for Olivia's achievements, but recognition of how her personal journey represented broader principles about resilience, authentic decision-making, and the power of aligning professional expertise with personal values. The widow who had purchased an abandoned mine with her last $250 had discovered not only Confederate gold, but also a pathway to rebuilding her life through work that honored both her professional capabilities and her commitment to preserving cultural heritage for future generations. As the celebration continued, Olivia reflected privately on how completely her circumstances had changed from that desperate morning when she had stared at foreclosure notices and contemplated financial ruin. The journey had been challenging and uncertain, but it had led to outcomes that exceeded anything she could have imagined when making that seemingly irrational decision to purchase an abandoned mining property with her last financial resources. Perhaps the most valuable lesson was that sometimes the most logical decision was to follow expertise and values rather than conventional wisdom, to recognize that personal capabilities and professional knowledge might reveal opportunities invisible to others who lacked similar training and perspective. The Confederate gold had provided financial security, but the true treasure had been discovering that her expertise remained valuable when applied in unconventional ways to challenges that others had abandoned as hopeless or worthless. The Silver Cliff mine's transformation from tax liability to national treasure had paralleled Olivia's personal transformation from financial desperation to professional fulfillment, both journeys demonstrating that hidden value often required specialized knowledge and determined effort to reveal. Sometimes the greatest opportunities appeared in what others had written off as worthless, and sometimes the most valuable resources were the expertise and values that helped recognize possibilities where others saw only problems. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.